I was sitting in my own living room when my son tried to have me arrested. Let that sink in for a moment. Not in a stranger's house. Not in a business dispute. Not even in a misunderstanding over property lines. No. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. In my own home. The house I had lived in for more than 3 decades. And the strangest part? My son stood in the doorway with 2 police officers behind him. And calmly told them I didn't belong there. Now imagine that scene for a second. You're 68 years old. You're sitting in the living room you've walked through thousands of times. The same couch. The same coffee table. Family photos lining the walls. A faint smell of lemon cleaner because you wiped the counters that morning. And suddenly your front door swings open. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Authority in the air. 2 uniformed officers walk in. And your own son points at you and says 3 words that make your stomach drop. She's trespassing. I didn't shout. I didn't panic. But inside, something cold settled in my chest. Because in that moment, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't confusion. My son, Daniel, had planned this. The officer closest to the door looked around the room slowly. His name tag read Marcus Hale. Mid-40s maybe. Calm eyes. The kind of officer who looked like he had seen a lot of strange situations. But even he seemed puzzled. Because everything in that house clearly belonged to someone who lived there. There were framed family photos on the wall. Pictures of Daniel as a child. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. One photo of my late husband Robert holding Daniel on his shoulders in the backyard. This house wasn't just decorated. It was lived in. And yet Daniel stood there with complete confidence. She refuses to leave, he told the officers. The younger officer beside him, Officer Lila Grant, crossed her arms slightly and looked from him to me. Then Officer Hale asked the simplest question in the world. Ma'am, do you live here? I nodded slowly. Yes. I do. My name is Stella Whitmore. I'm 68 years old. I retired from my job as an elementary school librarian about 6 years ago. I've lived in that house for 34 years. 34. Think about that. That's longer than some people keep careers. Longer than many marriages last. Long enough for a tiny oak tree in the yard to grow tall enough to shade half the street. I helped plant that tree with my husband Robert the year we moved in. Back then Daniel was only 4 years old. He learned to ride his bike in that driveway. He scraped his knees on that sidewalk. He opened Christmas presents right there on the carpet where the officers were now standing. So when he told the police I didn't live there, it felt like reality had suddenly tilted sideways. Officer Hale glanced around again. You're saying this is your property? He asked Daniel. Yes, Daniel replied immediately. I bought it last month. Bought it. That word hung in the air like smoke. I studied my son's face. Daniel Whitmore. 38 years old. Tall, well-dressed, expensive watch on his wrist. The same confident smile he used when he worked real estate deals. Except today he wasn't smiling. He looked impatient. Like this whole situation was just an annoying delay. Officer Grant spoke next. And you're saying she doesn't have permission to be here? Daniel shook his head. No. She's been refusing to leave. Now here's something interesting. When people lie, they often talk fast. They pile details on top of each other. But Daniel was calm. Very calm. Which made it even more unsettling. Because that meant he believed whatever he had planned was airtight. Officer Hale turned back to me. Ma'am. Do you have anything that shows you live here? Now I could have started arguing. I could have shouted. I could have pointed at the pictures on the wall and said, look around. Of course I live here. But I didn't do any of that. Instead, I did something much quieter. I reached into my handbag. Inside was a worn yellow envelope. The paper was slightly creased from being folded for years. I pulled it out slowly. The officers watched. Daniel frowned slightly. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked. I didn't answer him. Instead, I held the envelope out toward Officer Hale. "You might want to read this first," I said. He hesitated for a moment before taking it. The room suddenly felt very still. You know those moments where it feels like time pauses? Like everyone is waiting for something but no one knows exactly what it is yet. That's what it felt like. Officer Hale opened the envelope and slid out a stack of papers. He scanned the first page. Then the second. And something about his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a subtle shift. His eyebrows pulled together slightly. His posture straightened. Then he flipped to another page. And another. Daniel noticed it too. "What is that?" he asked. Officer Hale didn't answer right away. He read one final paragraph. Then he slowly lowered the paper. And for the first time since he walked into the house, he turned fully toward my son. The room was silent. Daniel tried to maintain his confidence, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his face. And then the officer asked him a question. A single question that made the color drain right out of his expression. "Son," Officer Hale said quietly, holding up the document, "do you know what this means?" Daniel didn't respond. So I folded my hands in my lap and said calmly, "He will in a second." But what Daniel didn't realize in that moment was that the truth about that house went back years. Long before he ever tried to claim it. And the story of how he thought he could take it from me had started months earlier. But what he did back then would soon come back to haunt him in a way he never expected. How does a son convince the police that his own mother is trespassing in her own house? That question didn't start the day the officers walked through my front door. It started months earlier. And looking back now, the warning signs were everywhere. At the time, though, I didn't see them. Because when your own child is involved, your mind doesn't jump to betrayal. It jumps to trust. Daniel Whitmore was 38 years old when all of this happened. My only child. Smart, confident, and very good at talking people into things. That skill had worked well for him in his career. He worked in real estate. And if you know anything about real estate agents, you know persuasion is half the job. For years Daniel had done well. Nice suits. Nice car. Always talking about the next big deal. But about a year before the police showed up at my door, things started changing. His visits became more frequent. At first, I was happy about that. What mother wouldn't be? He would stop by with groceries sometimes. Fix the squeaky cabinet hinge in the kitchen. Help trim the hedges in the yard. Small things. Thoughtful things. But then the conversation started shifting. One evening we were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when he asked something that caught my attention. "Mom, have you ever thought about how much this house is worth now?" I shrugged. "I imagine more than when we bought it." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "You have no idea. Houses in this neighborhood are selling for crazy numbers." Now, that was true. Our street had slowly become one of the more desirable areas in town. Families wanted good schools, quiet neighborhoods, big trees. Our block had all of that. But I had never really thought about selling. This wasn't just property. This was home. I smiled and said the same thing I had said many times before. "Well, it's not for sale." Daniel chuckled. "Everything's for sale, Mom. It's just a matter of timing." Something about that comment felt strange, but I brushed it off. Then the questions started coming more often. "What's left on the mortgage? Do you have the title somewhere safe? have you ever thought about downsizing? One afternoon he brought up retirement communities. You know, Mom, some of those places are really nice. Pool, social activities, medical staff on site. I laughed. Daniel, I'm 68. Not 98. He smiled politely, but I could see something else behind that smile. Calculation. At the time, I told myself he was just being practical. But the truth is, Daniel had something else on his mind entirely. The real turning point came about 3 months before the police showed up. Daniel arrived one afternoon carrying a folder. "Hey Mom," he said casually, setting it on the table. "I need your help with a few things." "What kind of things?" "Nothing complicated. Just paperwork." Paperwork. That word should have made me pause. But again, this was my son. He explained that there were some updates needed related to property taxes and insurance. Local regulations changed, he said. It's boring legal stuff. He flipped through a few pages and pointed to signature lines. Just sign here, and here. I adjusted my glasses and skimmed the first page. It looked official enough. Lots of small print. Government-looking formatting. But if you've ever seen legal paperwork, you know it can look like a foreign language. So I trusted him. I signed. 3 pages. Maybe 4. Daniel thanked me, slid the papers back into the folder, and gave me a quick hug. See? Easy. At the time, it felt harmless. Just helping my son with administrative nonsense. But about 2 weeks later, something odd happened. I checked my mailbox and saw a letter addressed to someone else. Daniel Whitmore. At my address. At first I assumed it was simple mail forwarding. Maybe he had accidentally used my address somewhere. But then another letter arrived the following week. And another. Each one addressed the same way. Daniel Whitmore. Property owner. Property owner. That phrase stuck with me. But again, I dismissed it. Until the day everything changed. Back in my living room, Officer Hale was now examining the paperwork Daniel had handed him. Daniel crossed his arms confidently. "You see," he said. "Everything's legal." Officer Grant looked over the documents as well. They appeared official. Stamped. Filed. Even notarized. Officer Hale looked at me. "Ma'am, your son is listed here as the property owner." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I simply nodded. "Yes," I said calmly. "That's what he believes." Daniel scoffed. "What I believe?" "Mom, it's literally on paper." That's when I gestured toward the envelope still in Officer Hale's hand. "You might want to keep reading." The officer glanced back down at the document I had given him. He flipped through the pages again. Then he stopped. His finger traced a paragraph slowly. Officer Grant leaned slightly closer. "What is it?" she asked. Officer Hale didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at Daniel with an expression that had completely changed. The calm neutrality was gone. Now there was something else in his eyes. Concern. "Mr. Whitmore," he said slowly, "before you filed these ownership documents, did you read the fine print?" Daniel blinked. For the first time since he walked into that house, his confidence faltered. "What fine print?" Officer Hale held up the document from my envelope. And the next thing he said made the entire situation take a very different turn. "Because according to this," he said, "you were never legally able to take ownership of this house in the first place." And suddenly, the man who thought he had just removed his mother from her own home realized he might have made a very serious mistake. But the most important part of that document was still buried in a single clause no one had mentioned yet. And when the officer read that clause out loud, everything in that room changed. One piece of paper can change everything. Think about that for a moment. A single sheet. A few signatures. A paragraph of legal language most people never bother reading. And suddenly an entire situation flips upside down. That's exactly what was happening in my living room. Officer Marcus Hale was still holding the document I had taken out of the envelope. He looked down at it again, scanning the page more carefully now, as if he wanted to make sure he hadn't misread something the first time. Beside him, Officer Lila Grant leaned in slightly. "What does it say?" she asked quietly. Daniel shifted his weight impatiently. "I already showed you the ownership transfer," he said. "That's the relevant paperwork." But Officer Hale didn't respond to him. Instead, he looked at me. "Ma'am," he asked, "when did you sign this trust agreement?" I didn't even have to think about it. 2009, I said. Right after my husband passed away. That name hung in the room for a moment. Robert Whitmore. My husband of 41 years. Daniel's father. The man who had insisted we get our legal affairs in order after his health started declining. At the time, I hadn't understood why he was so determined about it. But Robert had always been the cautious one. He believed in planning ahead. Daniel interrupted the silence. "That's irrelevant," he said quickly. "The property was transferred recently." Officer Hale finally turned toward him. "No," he said calmly. "Actually, it's very relevant." That was the moment Daniel's confidence began to crack. You could see it in small ways at first. The tightening of his jaw. The way his arms uncrossed. The way he leaned slightly forward, trying to see the document in the officer's hands. "What exactly are you looking at?" Daniel asked. Officer Hale flipped back to the first page of the document. "This," he said, tapping the paper, "is a living trust." Now here's something many people don't realize. A living trust is different from a simple will. When a property is placed inside a trust, ownership doesn't operate the way people usually expect. The trust itself holds the property, and the trustee controls how it's managed. In this case, the paperwork was very clear. I was the primary trustee. Officer Hale began reading aloud. Property address, 2147 Willow Creek Drive. Asset placed under the Whitmore Family Living Trust, dated June 14, 2009. Officer Grant nodded slowly. "So the house belongs to the trust," she said. "Correct," Hale replied. Daniel frowned. "That doesn't matter," he insisted. She signed the transfer documents. Officer Hale flipped a few pages deeper into the trust agreement. "Maybe," he said. "But there's something else here." He stopped reading. And when he did, his eyebrows lifted slightly. That tiny reaction was enough to make the tension in the room spike. Because whatever he had just seen, he hadn't expected it. "Interesting," he muttered. Daniel stepped forward. "What is it?" Officer Hale didn't answer right away. Instead, he read the paragraph again silently. Then he looked up at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he asked, "did your son know about this clause?" I shook my head. "No." Daniel's patience snapped. "What clause?" Now everyone in that room was focused on that one document. The officers. Daniel. Even my neighbor Arthur Delgado, who had quietly stepped into the doorway after noticing the police cars outside. The entire situation was balanced on that single paragraph. Officer Hale cleared his throat. "This trust includes a protection clause," he said. Daniel laughed nervously. "A protection clause? What does that even mean?" Officer Hale turned the document so Daniel could see the page. "It means," he explained slowly, "that ownership of this property cannot be transferred without direct authorization from the acting trustee." He paused. "And the acting trustee is Stella Whitmore." Daniel blinked. "Well, she signed documents." Officer Hale nodded slightly. "That's the issue." Officer Grant stepped closer and examined the paperwork Daniel had brought. She compared the signature on his transfer forms with the signature on the trust agreement. At first glance they looked similar. But when she tilted the page toward the light, something became obvious. The signature shapes were slightly different. Subtle differences. But noticeable. "Sir," Officer Grant asked, "did your mother sign these in front of a lawyer?" Daniel hesitated. "Not exactly." "Not exactly," she repeated. He shifted uncomfortably. "We handled it ourselves." Now the room felt colder. Because those 3 words changed everything. Handled it ourselves. Officer Hale looked back down at the trust agreement again. And that's when he saw the rest of the clause. The part that made his expression change completely. He read it silently. Then once more. Finally he looked up at Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his tone now much firmer, "this clause does something very specific." Daniel tried to laugh it off. "What, it stops a sale or something?" Officer Hale shook his head slowly. "No." He tapped the paragraph. "This clause states that any attempt to transfer ownership without verified authorization from the trustee automatically triggers a fraud review." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Fraud review. Daniel's face drained of color. Officer Grant looked at the transfer papers again, now with an entirely different perspective. "So if these documents were filed without proper authorization," she said carefully. Officer Hale finished the thought. "Then they could be considered fraudulent filings." Daniel immediately shook his head. "That's ridiculous." "She signed them." Both officers turned toward me. "Ma'am," Hale asked gently, "did you sign these ownership transfer documents?" I met his eyes and answered clearly. "No. I did not." Silence. Heavy silence. Daniel opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue again, but no words came out. And in that moment, the entire situation flipped. The police had arrived thinking I was trespassing. But now they were looking at Daniel very differently. Officer Hale closed the folder slowly. Then he said something that made Daniel take a step backward. "Mr. Whitmore, there's something else you should understand about this document." Daniel swallowed. "What?" Hale looked him directly in the eyes. "By calling us here today and claiming your mother was trespassing." He paused. "You may have just created the evidence needed to prove you knew this property transfer wasn't legitimate." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. Because the situation he thought he had completely under control was now unraveling faster than he could stop it. But the worst part for Daniel was still coming. Because Officer Hale wasn't finished reading that clause yet. And the next sentence in that trust agreement would make Daniel realize just how serious his mistake really was. At that moment, Daniel still thought this was just a misunderstanding. Embarrassing, maybe. Complicated. But fixable. You could see it in his posture. The way he kept trying to regain control of the conversation. The way he kept glancing between the officers, searching for some sign that this was all going to go back in his favor. But what Daniel didn't understand yet was that the situation had already shifted. And it had shifted in a way he couldn't undo. Officer Marcus Hale was still holding the trust agreement in his hand. The room had grown completely quiet now. Even the small sounds you normally hear in a house, the refrigerator humming, the faint ticking of a wall clock, felt louder. Officer Grant stood beside him, studying the documents Daniel had brought. The air in the room had changed. Before, the officers were here to remove someone. Now they were here to investigate something. Hale flipped to the final page of the trust agreement. Then he spoke. "Mr. Whitmore, there's another part of this clause you should hear." Daniel forced a small laugh. "Look, this is getting blown out of proportion." Hale ignored the comment and began reading. "In the event that an unauthorized attempt is made to transfer or claim ownership of trust property, the matter will be subject to immediate legal review." Documentation associated with such attempts may be treated as evidence of fraudulent filing. He lowered the page. And then he added something in plain language. In other words, he said calmly, if someone files ownership papers for this house without the trustee's authorization, those papers themselves can become evidence of fraud. Daniel stared at him. That's ridiculous, he said quickly. I told you, she signed them. Officer Grant stepped forward with the transfer documents. Let's talk about that for a second, she said. She placed the papers on the coffee table. Then she pointed to the signature. Mrs. Whitmore, is this your signature? I leaned forward and looked carefully. The name written there was Stella Whitmore. But it wasn't my handwriting. Not exactly, I said quietly. Daniel scoffed. Oh come on, Mom. You signed those at the kitchen table. Officer Grant tilted the paper slightly. Sir, signatures can look similar at first glance, she said. But there are usually small differences. She pointed to the curve in the first letter of my name. In this version, the S loops downward. Then she looked at the trust agreement. But on this document, it loops upward. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. That doesn't prove anything. Officer Hale stepped closer now. Mr. Whitmore, where exactly were these transfer documents signed? Daniel hesitated. At my office. And who witnessed them? Another pause. A notary. Name? Daniel blinked. I don't remember. That answer landed badly. Because if you've ever signed official property documents before, you know something important. You remember the notary. They check your ID. They stamp the paperwork. They verify the entire process. Officer Hale folded his arms. You don't remember the name of the notary who witnessed a property transfer worth several $100,000? Daniel looked around the room like he was trying to find a way out of the conversation. That's not the point, he said. Officer Grant raised an eyebrow. It's exactly the point. Meanwhile, my neighbor Arthur Delgado was still standing quietly near the doorway. He had lived on this street almost as long as I had. He finally spoke up. Officers, he said gently, Stella's been in this house longer than most of us. The officers nodded politely. But at this point, they didn't need the neighbor's testimony anymore. The paperwork was already telling its own story. Daniel tried a different tactic. Look, he said quickly, my mom's getting older. Maybe she forgot signing the papers. I felt a strange calm hearing that. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you reveal more than they realize. Officer Hale turned to me. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any memory of signing ownership transfer documents for this property? No, I said. Clear. Simple. Certain. That answer settled the question. The room went quiet again. Daniel's confidence was now completely gone. His shoulders had dropped slightly, and the careful tone he had used earlier was gone too. What are you saying? He asked the officers. That I forged something? Officer Hale chose his words carefully. I'm saying that right now we have two sets of documents. He held up the trust agreement. This one clearly establishes that the property belongs to the Whitmore Family Trust, with your mother as trustee. Then he tapped Daniel's paperwork. And this one claims ownership was transferred to you. Daniel swallowed. So, Hale continued, the signatures appear inconsistent, the transfer bypasses the trust protections, and the person listed as trustee says she never authorized it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. But Officer Hale wasn't finished. Mr. Whitmore, he said, there's another problem. Daniel looked up slowly. What problem? Hale's voice remained calm, but now there was a firmness behind it. You called the police today. Yes. You reported that your mother was trespassing. Yes. Hale nodded. But according to the trust agreement, she is the legal resident and trustee of this property. Daniel didn't respond. So the person you accused of trespassing, Hale continued, is actually the person with full legal authority to be here. Daniel's face had turned pale. And then Hale delivered the sentence that changed everything. That means the report you filed may itself be considered a false report. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. The entire plan he had walked into the house with was collapsing. The officers who were supposed to remove me were now looking directly at him. Officer Hale closed the folder. Then he turned to me. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "there's one more question we need to ask." I looked up. "Would you like to file a report regarding these documents?" The room went still. Daniel looked at me for the first time without confidence, without calculation. Just uncertainty. 38 years of memories sat between us in that silence. And the decision I made next would determine what happened to my son. But what I said in that moment was something Daniel never expected to hear. "If you had been sitting in that living room with us, you would have noticed something strange." The room had gone completely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence you get during a quiet afternoon. No. This silence was heavy. The kind that presses on your chest while everyone waits for someone to say the next thing. And in that moment, all eyes were on me. Officer Marcus Hale had just asked the question. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to file a report regarding these documents?" Simple question. But the weight behind it was enormous. Because this wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was my son standing in front of me. Daniel Whitmore. The boy I had raised in that very house. The same boy who used to run through the backyard chasing fireflies on summer nights. The same boy whose height I marked on the kitchen doorframe every birthday. And now he stood there looking smaller than I had ever seen him before. Not physically smaller, but uncertain. His shoulders had dropped. The confident tone he walked in with earlier had vanished. For the first time since he arrived with the police officers, Daniel looked nervous. "Mom," he said quietly. Just that one word. Mom. The word carried a strange mixture of guilt and hope, like he was waiting for me to rescue him from the consequences of what he had done. And that's the moment many people watching this story might ask themselves something. What would you do? Would you protect your child, no matter what? Or would you protect yourself? I looked at Daniel for a long moment. 38 years of memories passed through my mind in a matter of seconds. His first day of school. The time he broke his arm falling off his bike. The college graduation photo that still hung in the hallway. But there was another memory too. The moment just an hour earlier when he walked into my home and told 2 police officers that I didn't belong there. That memory sat heavier than the rest. Officer Hale waited patiently. He wasn't rushing me. He knew this wasn't just a legal decision. It was a personal one. Finally, I took a slow breath. "Yes," I said. The word landed softly in the room, but its meaning was clear. "Yes. I want it documented." Daniel's head snapped up. "Mom." I raised a hand gently. Not angrily. Just firmly. "This isn't about revenge," I said quietly. Then I looked at the officers. "It's about protecting myself." Officer Hale nodded. "That's completely understandable." Officer Grant began gathering the documents from the coffee table. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue again, but the words wouldn't come out this time. Because the reality of the situation had finally reached him. This wasn't a clever plan anymore. It was a legal problem. And possibly a very serious one. Officer Hale explained the next steps carefully. "There will likely be a review of the filing documents," he said. "If they determine the paperwork was submitted improperly, it could lead to an investigation." Daniel stared at the floor. "For fraud?" he asked quietly. Hale didn't jump to conclusions. "That depends on what investigators find." But everyone in the room understood what that meant. The officers finished collecting the papers. Before leaving, Officer Hale turned to me again. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "keeping documents like that trust agreement was a very smart move." I gave a small nod. But the truth was, that decision hadn't been mine. It had been Robert's. My husband had insisted we set everything up properly years ago. At the time, I thought he was just being overly cautious. Now I realized something important. Sometimes the people who plan ahead aren't being paranoid. They're being prepared. As the officers moved toward the door, Daniel finally spoke again. His voice sounded very different now. Quiet. Uncertain. "Mom. I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at him. And for the first time that afternoon, I answered him honestly. "You took it that far," I said. "Not me." Daniel didn't reply. He just stood there, staring at the floor. The officers stepped outside, and the flashing lights from the patrol cars reflected faintly through the front window. For a moment, the house felt strangely calm again. Like the storm had passed. But things would never feel exactly the same after that day. Over the next few weeks, Daniel tried calling me several times. His number showed up on my phone again and again. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes early in the morning. I didn't answer. Not because I hated him. And not because I wanted revenge. But because trust, once broken that deeply, doesn't repair overnight. Instead, I spent my time doing something simple. One Saturday morning, I walked into the front yard with a small shovel and a box of flower seedlings. The same kind of flowers Robert and I had planted the first year we moved into the house. The soil was soft. The sun was warm. And as I planted those flowers along the walkway, I realized something. That house wasn't just wooden walls. It was history. It was memory. It was the life I had built. And sometimes the people who think they know you best forget something very important. You were living a whole life long before they ever arrived in it. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you forgive immediately? Would you protect yourself first? Or would you have handled it differently? Because stories like this happen more often than people realize. And sometimes, the person who tries to take everything from you is someone you once trusted with everything.